Hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel, Evan Writes, where you can learn everything you need to know about writing from the perspective of an artist, animator, and game designer. I'm going to go ahead and continue with my series, Writing Lessons Learned from Animation. Today we are going to go ahead and cover the principle in animation of squash and stretch. Stick around if you don't know exactly what that means. I will explain it and give context to what it means and how I perceive it in terms of writing as well. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. In animation, squash and stretch is a principle that helps give the illusion of life to any type of drawing or animation. It is the principle that gives weight, a sense of gravity, a sense of movement, a sense of progression. And applying that to our writing is something that we all need to try to obtain. When learning animation, most animators start with the idea of a bouncing ball. I'm going to go ahead and show on the screen right now the idea of the bouncing ball. As the ball falls down, it starts to stretch as it gains speed, and once it impacts the ground, it flattens, so it squashes, and then in retaliation from the force push up from the ground, it stretches again, and so on and so forth until the ball eventually stops. Now that form of squash and stretch eventually becomes less and less as it loses its energy moving on. So the more often that same force is applied, the less energy is retained overall, and eventually the ball will stop. Now, there's a lot we can learn from this, not just from the side of physics, but also from the side of writing when we apply it to our characters and to our scene situations and ideas. We're going to go ahead and cover some of those things starting right now. The most important idea when it comes to squash and stretch is that it decides how a character is meant to react to situations, how forces applied to them make them change, and overall how strong they are as a character. The same thing can be applied to entire cities, entire states, or countries. It can be applied to groups of people. It can be applied to monsters, etc. It can be applied to really anything as long as you think about it in these terms. So we're going to go ahead and just talk about characters, because I'm sure you can find a way to apply it to everything else once you understand how it applies to characters. Now, squash and stretch varies depending on the materials, both the acting material, so the bouncing ball, for example, whatever that is made out of, and then the material it impacts, so i.e. the ground. What is the ground made of? Or if you throw it to a wall, what's the wall made of? So those are the two things you need to consider when considering your character. Is what is your character made of? What is their current status and their personality and their strengths and their weaknesses compared to the other material that they're impacting against, which would be a situation or another character, and how they react to that character is defined and will define how much they can squash and stretch. The squashing action, when applied to a character or a situation, an economy, anything like that, is essentially the conflict for that character. How much that character squashes tells us how strong that conflict is for that character. So this essentially provides a breaking point for the character or some form of difficulty. The more they squash, the more difficult a situation is. But in order to show that situation and show the growth of the character in a compelling way, we also need to have that character stretch afterwards. That character needs to grow and be able to change. When that change happens, the character becomes a stronger character, and it becomes more interesting because we can see that the character is progressing in a way that we can visually imagine as we read through that character. Now, not all characters change, and we will cover that in a little bit as we continue talking about specific materials of characters, but just keep in mind that the more a character is squashed, the more they are expected to stretch. If a character's entire world breaks down around them, they will not be the same person afterwards. And that is very important to keep in mind. All of the changing factors in your story that affect that character, this doesn't just apply to main characters, needs to be expressed through a change. Emotionally, physically, depending on the situation that happened. If a character broke an arm, that character is not just going to be healed right away because they need to deal with that. So we are going to talk about my principle of character materials. This is the material or the visual material that a character is made out of. Based on that material determines what kind of character it is. For example, if your character's material, we'll imagine your character's that bouncing ball again. If your character's material is rubber, it is expected that that ball will be able to squash and stretch significantly. As it falls, it will stretch more. As it impacts, it will squash more before the force shoots it back up. Now, what does that say for your character? If your character is inexperienced, aka made of rubber, or just hasn't gone through some of the means yet, or is just a very flighty character as it is, maybe they've experienced a lot but they haven't necessarily learned from it yet, well, that character is made of rubber. That character will act and react to situations much more strongly than other types of character materials. Now, character materials can vary greatly. For example, we have another character who would say is made of iron. Now, with iron, that is a significantly strong material. If you throw an iron ball, you will not expect it to bounce very much. It'll hit the ground, maybe bounce a little bit, and then roll. It will not give us a nice reaction after it hits. And that character we can refer to as stronger characters. These are characters who have already been developed in significant ways, i.e. James Bond, Superman, Batman. These characters that have experienced their character arc already and are strong, and therefore we watch more or read more for these characters to see how they react to situations or how other people react to them. It is not their character growth that we read the story for. Moreover, it's the theme of the story that we read or the growth of the characters they interact with. If we want a character made of iron to grow and stretch, well, that requires a significantly stronger force to obtain. And that means that this character has to pass through something that is unbendable, something with so much force, so much heat that the iron will bend and bounce and move. It means it has to be shooting out with a significant force, and it has to impact something just as strong. If an iron ball falls onto a pillow, it will not bounce at all because that pillow will suck in that iron ball. So this is like Superman having to stop bank robbers. We know he's going to stop them. They don't possess any threat to them whatsoever. So Superman does not grow at all. He hits that pillow as an iron ball, and that pillow just stays still because the iron ball is holding it down. So we already know what's going to happen, and what's more important is how that story is spun in the media and how that affects Superman as opposed to the actual event that happened. Or, for example, James Bond, we know he's going to beat the bad guys, so things don't feel necessarily as difficult for him, and we always know he's going to come out on top. So if your character is made of iron, you need to make something much more demanding of that character. The world needs to hang on their shoulders. They need to have significant weaknesses be brought to light that they did not necessarily have in the public eye before. A villain needs to be able to exploit them in some way, and that will stretch and squash the character. What is going to make that strong character who's already been established really feel like he is in trouble? And that, for example, for Superman, is often putting other people in danger, and Superman has to decide between saving one person over another or stopping some calamity in some part of the world that would further somebody's plan or save this other group of people. The same thing was done in the Spider-Man movie, the first one, a long time ago, where Green Goblin had people hanging down versus his girlfriend Mary Jane, and he had to decide if he was going to save this trolley full of people or his girlfriend. He ended up being able to save them both, but that was a character defining moment for him. He did not know if he could do it, and any choice he made, if somebody had died as a result of that, he would have hated himself from that time on, and that would have changed his character significantly. And we see that a lot with, for example, Edward Elric in Full Metal Alchemist. After he passes through the thing with Nina and Hughes, we see those events come back over and over again because those are the events that squashed him so hard that it changed his entire outlook on life, and he was never able to get over it in the same way. And that made his character change, even though he was a pretty strong character before that. So it is depending on your character's material and the forces that they are impacting what your story is going to show. If you want your character to grow, the forces that are changing that character have to be symbolic and equal or stronger to the character's strength as it is. If your character is made of rubber, it's a lot easier to make that character feel like their life is ending. If you are writing a story about somebody progressing through high school, an F on a test could very easily be a soul-crushing moment for that character. But if you applied that to Batman, he wouldn't care. He's a billionaire. That literally does not affect him whatsoever. So Batman would be made of iron, while the other one would be made of rubber in that situation. So depending on your character and their state in life and what they are going through, it will depend on the story you need to tell and what really affects that person. That's why we can go and watch a story of world-ending proportions like Lord of the Rings, or what other things, like any superhero movie really, that feel like the world will end, and that's huge stakes. And then we can go over next and watch a movie about a love story, and the stakes is literally, will he get the girl or not, and still be just as interested, because the stakes aren't, there's no way that getting a love interest is as big of stakes of losing the entire universe. But we know that the stakes for that character is it's everything that he gets that girl. So it makes us interested in that story because we know that he's going to grow and that this situation is strong for him. And that makes that story interesting for us because the stakes are equal to the characters. And that's what we need to pay attention to in Squash and Stretch. Your character will squash based on the events that happen to that character, and then they need to stretch afterwards. They need to grow in proportionate response to that changing factor. When it comes to Squash and Stretch in animation, the most important thing an animator can learn is something called volume retention. Volume retention, to put it in a short, succinct way, is making sure that the object, for example, the bouncing ball, does not grow bigger or smaller than it should as it's squashing and stretching. It has to retain the same amount of air, the same amount of volume as it moves, or it looks weird and it doesn't necessarily make sense to us. When we apply that to our writing, we need to make sure that as the character squashes and stretches, that character does not perform actions that are outside of the character's ability to do or outside of our expectations for that character. For example, a character who only cares about themselves isn't all of a sudden going to decide to help everybody else just out of the kindness of his heart. He has to have a strong enough, compelling moment to make us believe that he actually would react in that situation. So we need to make sure that we keep volume retention on our characters. Are we keeping our characters true to themselves even as they grow and change and react to situations? If not, we either need to make that situation stronger or we need to change the character's reaction to better fit that character's personality. Are they made of fabric? Are they made of plastic? Are they made of glass? All those kinds of ideas. When you think about a character made of glass, you know that they will break when hitting almost any surface. They have to hit a really soft event or they will break. If there's some sort of cataclysmic event, this character most likely will not be able to deal with it because they're made of glass and they will shatter. Their whole world will crumble, and we don't know if they'll be able to pull themselves out of it. If a character is made of rubber, they're pretty good at dealing and moving on, but their reactions to every action is significantly exaggerated, and they are expected to change quite a bit. They are expected to stretch quite a bit as they move on, and the more often they hit that same ground, that same material from that same applied force, the more easy it is for them to deal with it, and eventually they will come to a stop and they will be okay. But they will have stretched and moved from that. If they are made of iron, it's going to take significant force to get that character to bend, to get them to change, to get them to grow, because they've already gone through their arc. They've already hardened themselves. They've already become their strong character. So in that, it's more interesting to see the situations bend as a result of being hit and how those situations change as a result of the inclusion of that character. So the situation and the people who react to that character end up becoming more of the focus in that kind of story. And finally is the principle of volume retention. Make sure that your character is acting and reacting in a manner that is true to that character, that they are not changing size or shape as they're moving and reacting, and that character will be true to themselves. Thank you again for listening. I hope this helps you in some of your writing. If you like this series of videos and want to learn more about the principles of animation and how I see writing through the lens of animation and the principles that I was taught, go ahead and let me know in the comments. I really like talking about it this way because it's something that is how I've seen writing for a long time, and it's really interesting to me, and I hope that it provides a little bit more of a different kind of insight for you as well compared to a lot of the other AuthorTube or BookTube videos you've listened to. Anyway, go ahead, if you like this video, like and subscribe and do all the things. I hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, it's Evan Wrights, and I hope you have a great day. I will see you on the other side.